In Jesus' name, amen. In the 1964 State of the Union address, January 8th, 1964, Lyndon Johnson said this, quote, "This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America. I urge this Congress and all Americans to join with me in that effort." And so began the so-called War on Poverty. And within the next few months, Lyndon B. Johnson and Congress started passing laws that were meant to address this war on poverty. 4 of the most major and long-lasting ones were these. 1 resulted in community ed and Head Start, community-based programs that would help the poor to receive education. The second one provided food stamps and food benefits. The third was a heavy investment in public education, trying to beef up the public schools. And the fourth was Social Security that had been created. Again, until that time, those things had been really more localized, and this was an attempt to federalize some of these programs. It addressed a real problem in America that many were facing, this idea of poverty. Now, I'll tell you how it went at the end of the message. But we ought to commend the effort of government to do something about poverty. Something is the right thing to do rather than nothing. We recognize the oughtness of those who do well to help those who are needy, especially when there's life in danger. We applaud those efforts to try to save lives, especially those threatened by poverty. This is true of society at large, but it's more true, I think, for Christians, that we ought to be people that are very much concerned with poverty. We're asking the question, what can we do and what should we do? We might have an idea of things that we can do, but what are things that we should do? Are those things always the same? So this series, again, will tackle 3 points, 1 each week. I invite feedback. I got some last week, and I appreciate that. I'll address most of those, I think, next week that I had, but if you have anything that you'd like to share with me that might help me, I got some helpful feedback even this afternoon that I will incorporate into next week's message as well. But we talked last week, first of all, about the existence of the poor. This week, we'll talk about the obligation to the poor, and next week, Lord willing, we'll talk about the church, New Testament Christianity, and the poor. We said last week when we talked about the existence of the poor, first, that the definition of people in poverty are those who have needs that they cannot meet by themselves. We said then also that the Bible acknowledges the existence of the poor, that it doesn't try to get around the fact that that does exist, that poverty does. We talked about the causes of poverty, a lack of access to food, lack of access to housing, to work, to good jobs, to health benefits. There are also personal causes, tragedy, victimhood, or even sloth. One of the things we talked about just briefly last week was something called generational poverty. And I referenced this book, and then I found it this week. I didn't know what happened to it, but surprise, surprise, it was in my office. It was under a stack of books that had to do with counseling where I wouldn't have looked because this isn't really a counseling book. But this is Framework for Understanding Poverty by Ruby K. Payne, PhD. The edition I'm looking at right now is the 4th edition, which came out in 1996, it looks like. This is a 2005 edition. So a really interesting book, and if you'd like to borrow this from me to understand the poverty mindset, why is it that people do what they do? Why is it that they act that way? Why don't they act more like me? Well, you're thinking of a middle class mentality and not a poverty mindset. So just kind of whet your appetite a little bit and kind of give you this, what we're dealing with. It says this, Generational poverty is defined as having been in poverty for at least 2 generations. However, the patterns begin to surface much sooner than 2 generations if the family lives with others who are from generational poverty. Situational poverty is defined as lack of resources due to a particular event. We talk about that too as well, right? A death, chronic illness, divorce. Generational poverty has its own culture, hidden rules, and belief systems. One of the key indicators of whether it's generational or situational poverty is the prevailing attitude. Often the attitude in generational poverty is that society owes one a living. In situational poverty, the attitude is often one of pride and refusal to accept charity. Individuals in situational poverty often bring more resources with them to the situation than those in generational poverty. Of particular importance is the use of formal register. And I'm not going to explain all that because the book does. Here are some of the characteristics of generational poverty. Background noise. Almost always the TV is on, no matter what the circumstance. Conversation is participatory, often with more than one person talking at a time. The importance of personality. Individual personality is what one brings to the setting because money is not brought. The ability to entertain, tell stories, have a sense of humor is highly valued in generational poverty. The significance of entertainment. When one can merely survive, then the respite from the survival is important. In fact, entertainment brings respite. 4, the importance of relationships. One only has people upon whom to rely, and those relationships are important to survival. One often has favorites. 5 is the matriarchal structure. The mother has the most powerful position in the society if she functions as a caretaker. 6 is the oral language tradition. The casual register is used for everything. There's no formal register for them. Next is survival orientation. Discussion of academic topics is generally not prized. There's little room for the abstract. Discussions center around people and relationships. A job is about making enough money to survive. A job is not about a career. Next, identity is tied to the lover or fighter role for men. The key issue for males is to be a man. The rules are rigid, and a man is expected to work hard physically and to be a lover and a fighter. Identity tied to rescuer martyr role for the women. A good woman is expected to take care of and rescue her man and her children as needed. The importance of nonverbal kinesthetic communications. Touch is used to communicate, as are space and nonverbal emotional information. Ownership of people. People are possessions. There's a great deal of fear and comment about leaving the culture and getting above your raisings. Negative orientation. Failure at anything is the source of stories and numerous belittling comments. Discipline. Punishment is about penance and forgiveness, not change. Belief in fate, destiny, and fate are the major tenets of the belief system. Choice is seldom considered. Polarized thinking, options are hardly ever examined. Every time everything is polarized, it is one way or the other. These kind of statements are common. I quit and I can't do it. I'll skip the last one. Time only occurs in the present. The future does not exist except as a word. Time is flexible and not measured. Time is often assigned on the basis of the emotional significance and not on actual measured time. A sense of humor is highly valued as entertainment is one of the key aspects of poverty. Humor is almost always about people, either situations that people encounter or things people do to each other. Lack of order or organization. Many of the homes, apartments of people in poverty are unkempt and cluttered. Devices for organization, files, planners do not exist. And lastly, they live in the moment. They don't consider future ramifications. Being proactive, setting goals, planning ahead are not part of the generational poverty. Most of what occurs is reactive, and in the moment, future implications of present actions are seldom considered. So again, that just kind of tells us in some ways what we're dealing with when you have a culture of poverty, especially generational poverty, that people are dealing with. And so let's look at what the Bible said in the Old Testament about how a society, and again, I started with the idea that the American federal government decided that they were going to take first point on the war on poverty. We recognize that that can be a good thing. And so when God was creating this society that Israel would live in, what does he say about the poor and how the poor should be treated? So let's first of all look at negative obligations, or obligations from a negative standpoint. Really, the don't. We'll look at the do in a moment, but the don't. We see how easy it is in Scripture for poor people to become victims. And so there's an important protection put into the law to say, don't do this to the poor. Why is it that the poor are more easily victims? One, they don't have the wherewithal to fight for themselves. They can't generally hire lawyers. They don't know, maybe they're not smart enough to know how to advocate for themselves. They don't necessarily see a trick coming because they are not well informed enough. They don't see a scam coming or something like that. And often even because of their situation, they don't have the support of their neighbors. Proverbs 14:20 says, the poor is hated even of his own neighbor, but the rich hath many friends. That's true, isn't it? You have to find people in poverty that they don't trust other people in poverty. They're kind of on their own. You have someone who's wealthy. They have lots of connections, lots of people who can help them if there's a need. And that makes them more vulnerable. They're also desperate. They'll make bad decisions in an attempt to get ahead. This makes people in poverty a great source of trafficking. They're trying to make their life better through harlotry, etc. In fact, 23% of homeless people engaged in sex trafficking, according to the NSVRC. Casinos also prey on poor people. I was going through town. I was heading to Nevis, I think, or Akeley, and a guy was hitchhiking, and I picked him up. I always try to, if I have time, I haven't done it now for years, but try to pick up male hitchhikers, and I can talk to them about the Lord. And as we're going, I said, where are you headed? He said, well, I'm going to the casino over in Hackensack. I said, what are you going to do there? He's like, well, I need a truck. I was like, okay. He had some money, and he was going to try to go and see if he could turn his, whatever it was, $1,000 into more, where he could get himself a truck. And, well, you say, well, that's silly. Well, people in desperate situations, if it's something like, I really think that this could happen, I heard about this on the news or whatever, and this is, so again, casinos are not built for rich people. Despite all the James Bond films, casinos are really meant to, especially in our area, prey on the poor, which is why I don't go. I've heard that they have great meals, and it's a great deal on the meal you can get, but I'm personally not going to support a pariah organization like that. The margin then is much less for people in poverty. Another reason they're more likely to be victims is the margin is just so much small. So they're right on the edge, and that margin of error that we have maybe a lot of. Oh well, if something really bad happen, I have a savings account. I have some friends. I have a church family. I have whatever it is. Well, we could live without spending money on the food that we have in our house for a week or so, maybe longer if you're the Georges. Or the Oberlanders, I don't know. Anyway, but, that margin is big, but for most people in poverty, that margin is real small. Their kid gets sick, and they have to stay home from work, and now they're in real trouble, and you couldn't do anything about that. The boss is going to be more easy. It's going to be more easy. It's going to be more likely that the boss will fire them because they're not maybe as needed. So because of this, the poor are unique. They're a unique subset worth protecting and understanding that again, we all know stories of people that did it to themselves. We also know stories of people that had that done to them, or people, even if they'd done it to themselves or their parents did it to them. We also understand as a church that we have an obligation. So what did God, when he set up this society in Israel, what did he say to protect those in poverty against becoming victims? One, he says you can't make them victims of poor judgment. So we're in Leviticus 19. Look at verse 15. You shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. Thou shalt not respect the person of the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty, but in righteousness shalt thou judge thy neighbor. You can't make them victims of poor judgment, or because they're poor, they can't get a bad sentence. Honestly, according to this, they shouldn't also get a good sentence. They should be judged on the merits of the case. Again, because of desperation, many poor people are more likely to commit crimes. I couldn't find a lot of stats that talked about that necessarily. I think just generally true. Whenever I looked up stats, they always wanted to talk about something else and the systemic oppression in the justice system rather than poverty and actual crimes. And so that's why it was hard for me to come up with actual numbers. But what I said last week at the end of the service in Proverbs chapter 30, verse 9, where the author says, don't give me too much, where I say, who's the Lord? And don't give me too little, where I'm going to be tempted to steal. And so there's that idea that the poor are more likely to commit crimes. When they commit crimes, they need justice as a great equalizer. If they've done something wrong, they ought to be punished, but they shouldn't be more punished than someone who is maybe wealthier and can benefit the judge. Now, we recognize this in America by providing public defenders. How much do you think that Minnesota spent on public defenders in 2020? $93 million. $93.6 million. Nationally, in 2020, it was $2.3 billion. So quite a bit on public defenders. Now, that's a good thing, right? That's a good thing that we are able to provide lawyers for people that cannot provide for themselves. But again, the judges are to treat everyone equally as people made in God's image. Oppressing the poor in judgment is heavily, heavily prohibited throughout Scripture. So what can we do? None of us are a judge. None of us are sitting behind the bench. What can we do? Well, one, it's good to promote laws that don't oppress the poor. Now, isn't that a hot button political topic? Because we all have a different opinion about what laws are oppressing the poor or not. But it's good for us as Christians to think through what these laws actually do and who they actually benefit. I'm not someone who would say, tax the rich and give universal basic income to the poor, and that will solve all of life's problems. It's not that easy, and I'm not even sure that that's the right solution. In fact, I'm not an economist, but I'm almost positive that would actually make things much, much worse for everybody involved. However, the idea that we should promote laws that don't oppress the poor and help the poor, that is a good thing. It's also good to advocate for those who need it, to stand up for them. Sometimes all those in poverty need is someone to write a letter on their behalf, someone to be able to advocate for them, someone even who can go and say, let's help you get this figured out, someone who can be a character witness or something like that. I'm not saying that we need to go into the jail and find people that are really wrong and they've really done something wrong, but I'm saying there are people all around us that we are not necessarily likely to befriend, but those people need a friend, like maybe you or I, that can help advocate for them. Proverbs 31:9 says, open thy mouth, judge righteously, and plead the cause of the poor and needy. There is that idea that we should not oppress the poor because they are poor judicially. 2, we cannot charge them interest. We, according to, no, this isn't we, again, this is a church, it's different. Israel, they were not allowed to charge interest. So look at Leviticus 25. Go over to Leviticus 25. Verse 36, take thou no usury of him or increase, but fear thy God, that thy brother may live with thee. Thou shalt not give him thy money upon usury, nor lend him thy victuals for increase. Again, I guess I skipped verse number 35. If thy brother be waxen poor and fall into decay with thee, then shalt thou relieve him, yea, though he be a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with thee. Thou shalt take thou no usury of him or increase, but fear thy God, that thy brother may live well with thee. Thou shalt not give him thy money upon usury, nor lend him thy victuals for increase. Okay, so the idea there is don't treat the poor like a business opportunity. There's nothing necessarily wrong with loaning money. There's nothing necessarily wrong with loaning money for interest. If you've got a child who's trying to get started in life and they say, Mom, Dad, can I have money? You say, well, you can borrow money, and we're going to charge you some interest based on whether you think they need to or not. If you're trying to help them out, then maybe you would say, no, we're not going to charge you interest, but you do have to make X payments back to us. You are allowed to expect it back. Again, he's not saying give it to them if they ask, and don't and don't charge, don't expect for it back in payments, but you are not allowed to charge interest. Again, the point is that you see them as a person in need, not as something to profit from. We're not trying to profit off of someone else's poverty. In Psalm 15, when it asks the question in Psalm 15, who shall abide in thy tabernacle? And the answer at the end of the verse in Psalm 15, verse 5, is he that putteth not out his money to usury, nor taketh reward against the innocent. He that doeth these things shall never be moved. So again, who's the person that God loves, who loves God, who wants to follow the Lord, is someone who's not going to take advantage of the poor by charging interest. Borrowing can be a great way to get ahead. It can be a great way to get past a hard time. And there are times where that would be appropriate, again, temporarily, to be able to loan money. I personally think that parents who give their adult children money or a stipend are not necessarily helping them. That's between you and the Lord. I understand that. I'd much, and again, here I am without adult children. Well, mostly. But ones that aren't, I guess, asking for money, maybe I would change my mind. But I do think it would be better to say, well, I will loan you money and you can pay me back, but there needs to be some expectation. When people come in and they ask for help from the church, I tell them, listen, we're giving you this money as a gift. However, if when things are better for you, you would like to come and pay that back, we would be more likely to help you and others in the future. And I'm not surprised to know that no one has ever taken me up on that before. We did get a letter years ago of a young woman asking for a loan so that she could buy a car, and she had a whole plan on how she would pay it back. And we didn't end up doing it for different reasons, but I've always remembered that letter and thought, that is actually something that we as a church could help with, but there would have to be some kind of personal connection, I think. Anyway, all that to say, we would, according to what one of the things that God said when he's setting up the society is don't charge interest. You can charge interest to the heathen. You can have business opportunities. Somebody wants to borrow money, they're not in poverty, and you want to take a business opportunity, but when they're poor, then you just let them borrow it and they'll pay it back and without charging interest. Look at verse 39. Another aspect is you can't sell them into slavery. If they do need a job, you pay them wages, not as a slave. So verse 39, if thy brother that dwelleth by thee be waxen poor, and be sold unto thee, thou shalt not compel him to serve as a bondservant, but as a hired servant, and as a sojourner. Again, this is temporary. He shall be with thee, and shall serve thee unto the year of Jubilee. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then shall he depart from thee, both he and his children with him, and shall return into his own family, and unto the possession of his fathers shall he return. For they are my servants, which I brought forth out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as bondmen. Thou shalt not rule over him with rigor, but shall fear thy God. Again, if they need a job, you pay them wages. You don't treat them as a slave who is free labor because they're hard up. You don't treat them like a victim. You do well for them. They were allowed to enslave those in the surrounding other nations. They were allowed to enslave them, but not their own people, and especially not with vigor, especially not cruelly. Again, today we call businesses to pay fair wages, to not treat people as a bottom line, but to have an interest in helping people and others up. Again, even later on, it'll say that if they're sold to a foreigner, so if all of a sudden Zach goes into hard times and in ancient Israel and he's has to be sold to a Moabite, then we would go and we would pay the money to get Zach sprung from Moabite jail and Moabite slavery to redeem him. We want to do whatever we can to get our brothers out of that trouble that they're in. Number 4, you cannot oppress them by keeping their pledges, especially the important ones. So now we're going to come back to Leviticus, but let's go jump up to Deuteronomy chapter 24. Deuteronomy 24. So sometimes you couldn't charge usury, but it was okay for you to sometimes take some collateral. A pledge is the word that the Bible uses. And pledge is a better a better word because it implies that there's a promise that I'm going to pay this back. So again, it would be like, well, you know what collateral is, I guess. That's the word we use. And again, it's not as good to use as pledge, but here I need to borrow $1,000 from Rod. And he's like, okay, but what will you give me to prove that you will pay me back? And so I look around my garage and I say, well, how about my bandsaw? And he's like, well, and I'll go, okay, well, how about my bandsaw and my chainsaw and my table saw? And he's like, you know what? That'll be good enough. Now, that's going to be difficult for me, and every time I go in the garage, I'm going to see that empty spot. I'm going to be like, oh, yeah, I got to pay Rod back. I'm going to work a little extra so I get a little extra money so I can pay him that $1,000 back, and Rod would keep that until he was all paid up, and then he'd give me back my pledge. Again, it's not just collateral. It's a promise. I promise I'll pay you back. And he's like, I trust you, but also it's okay for me to take a token of your promise that you will pay me back. So here in Deuteronomy 24, verse 10, when thou dost lend thy brother anything, thou shalt not go into his house to fetch his pledge. Thou shalt stand abroad, and the man to whom thou dost lend shall bring out the pledge abroad unto thee. And if the man be poor, thou shalt not sleep with his pledge. In any case, thou shalt deliver him the pledge again when the sun goeth down, that he may sleep in his own raiment and bless thee, and it shall be righteousness unto thee before the Lord thy God. So again, sometimes when money was borrowed, they needed a pledge or collateral. That motivated them to pay off the debt sooner, and it also reminded them that they had an obligation to pay. There was something tangible in the promise, I will pay you back. Now, where does that show up in our society today? Mostly pawn shops, right? That's the idea, like, hey, I need money to pay this off. I'll give you this, and I've never, ever pawned anything, so I don't actually know how it works. But generally, there's a term. You have 30 days or 60 days or maybe 90 days to pay that back. And if you don't, then they get to keep that thing, and then they can sell it for money. I've been in the pawn shop. I've looked around, and the one uptown here, Fuller's. But I never actually bought anything from them, and I've never pawned anything, so I don't know how it goes. But generally, that's the idea, that there's a pledge, and they hang on to it. Well, so there are some rules then to protect those who needed to borrow. One, you couldn't take it from them. You had to wait for them to bring it out to you. And again, there's a human dignity part of that, right? Where I'm not going into your house and like, hey, give me that. I'm going to take this with me, and you pay me back. And I'll give you this back. No, you would wait outside and you say, listen, I loaned you this money, and you said you were going to give me a token, and so that they bring it out to you. And again, just for dignity's sake. Number two, if it was an important pledge, you would return it to them at night. So generally, what does the poor person have? Not much. Not much of anything. And so sometimes it would be their coat. Now, again, you maybe don't understand all of this, but generally people in Bible times, they had like a loincloth, and then they had a tunic. It would come to maybe down here, and that's what they would work in. And then at night, they would put their coat over, and they would sleep in their coat. And he said, you can go to their house in the morning and say, listen, you owe me my $50, and then they would surrender their coat to you. But then you had to bring it back at night and say, here's your coat back. I'll be back tomorrow morning to get it again. And again, it was another reminder that they've got to be paying this off. But you're not so cruel that you're depriving them of something that is going to help them sleep at night or something that they actually need. Look at verse number 6 in chapter 24. It says, no man shall take the nether or the upper millstone to pledge, for he taketh a man's life to pledge. So again, you understand how that goes. There's generally, they have the big millstones, but then generally people had their own millstones at home where they would grind out their grain. And he says, you can't take the millstone away from them as a pledge because they need that. They're not, you're going to kill them if you take that for a pledge, and so don't do that. There are certain things you couldn't do. And again, not that people were just expected to give, but that there was an expectation that they could take a pledge, that you would a promise that you would give it back. And the Bible says it's a pretty serious sin to take advantage of the poor in this way. Job 22, verse 6, thou hast taken a pledge from thy brother for naught and stripped the naked of their clothing. Job 24:3, another accusation. They drive away the ass of the fatherless. They take the widow's ox for a pledge. You have this woman who doesn't have anything, but she's got this ox, and she's out there trying to make it for herself, and some wicked person comes along and says, give me that ox for your pledge. Well, how am I supposed to pay you back if you're taking away my livelihood here? Again, for us, it would be appropriate for us to expect something in return for our help. Deuteronomy 24, verse 15, then finally, now again, this isn't across the board, but this is just to say, if you're going to pay them a wage, you give it to them in a timely manner. So verse 15, at his day thou shalt give him his hire, neither shall the sun go down upon it, for he is poor, and setteth his heart upon it, lest he cry against thee unto the Lord, and it be a sin unto thee. So again, don't withhold the payment. Now again, most of us get paid when we were working, every week or every other week or something like that. But in these times, you take that money, and that was your daily needs, and so you'd take it. And so rather than saying, oh, we'll just store it up and give it to you later, he said, don't oppress the poor that way. Now, that's the negative obligations, right? But let's look at some positive obligations back in Leviticus chapter 19. Verse 9 says, and when ye reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest, and thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of thy vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and stranger. I am the Lord your God. So first of all, positively, so there's the negative part, like don't oppress the poor in this way, but now we have the positive. When you are harvesting your field, leave some in the corners. Now, again, that's easy in some way for us to see with tractors and irrigation. Most of our fields are round for those reasons. That maybe wouldn't have been the case here. But if there was a corner where you had some things and the plow was coming through. And anyway, all that to say, when you had a field, what you were supposed to do is leave the corners for the poor. It was something for them to be able to come and get it. When you go through your vineyard, don't pick every single grape. Just pick the ones that you have. And if you notice, I missed one, leave it. Because I don't know if you ever picked grapes, but I think I told you that Lydia had a whole crate of them. I look back at my pictures, it was a bowl. I don't know why I remembered a crate, but it was a bowl. Anyway, I just remembered that, and I lied to you. So it was a mistake. But if you ever picked grapes, you think you got them all, and then you lift up the leaf, and there's another cluster under there. And so what God says is don't do that. Get the ones that you can see, and you're allowed, because they're your grapes, to harvest them. Just don't be so stingy where you're like, I've got to get every grape off this vine. Or I've got to get every fig off this tree. Or I've got to get, whatever it is, every potato out of the ground or every carrot. I've got to go for all of it. No, you would leave some of that behind for the poor. Leave the corners to come and glean. Now, of course, that tells us that the poor still had to go out and get it, right? And the Bible never says, when you gather your harvest, take 20% of your harvest and give it to the poor, and they don't have to do anything, just take it to their house. No, he says, leave it for them, and they can come and get it. So what's the best example of this in Scripture? It was probably Ruth, right? Ruth went out there, and she worked hard. Now, Naomi noticed, you worked hard, I'm sure you did, but wow, that's a lot, right? You got a lot of stuff, and she was working hard. She'd only take a little, drink with the workers or whatever, but she was working hard. But there was something about how much she brought home where Naomi noticed, someone is being kind to you. And remember, Boaz even said, let some handfuls just drop on the ground as you're harvesting. Just oops, some grain, and then Ruth would come and get it. So it was kind of meager in a way. It wasn't a lot, but it was something. It was something, but the poor had to go get it. And if Ruth was like, what, it's a hot day, there's a lion out in the streets, whatever the reason was, I'm just not going to go. Well, then you wouldn't eat either. there would be an obligation that you would go and get your own things. Gleaning and the opportunity for food. They were also permitted to bring in a lesser sacrifice. Back in Leviticus chapter 14, verse 21, it talks about this. The priest shall offer, in verse 20, the burnt offering and the meat offering upon the altar, and the priest shall make an atonement for him, and he shall be clean. And then verse 21 says, if he be poor and cannot get so much, then he shall take one lamb for a trespass offering to be waved to make an atonement for him, and 1/10 deal of fine flour mingled with oil for a meat offering and a log of oil, and 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, such as he is able to get, and the one shall be a sin offering and the other a burnt offering. Again, so there's provision for the poor. They still had to go and make sacrifices, but he said, if you can't, then go and get a dove. Now, here's the thing. I'm assuming that they didn't actually keep doves like in their house. It's not like sheep or goats or bulls that you knew where your bulls and your goats were. You tried to have either somebody watching them all the time out in the field where they're grazing, or you had some kind of pen to put them in. I'm guessing that wasn't true necessarily for doves. So if I'm a poor person in ancient Israel and I'm like, I have this uncleanness, or I have to go see the priest, I have a sin that I've done, I don't have any sheep. I've got one sheep. I've got one. I got a male goat and a female goat, and I'm milking that goat and hoping they're going to have a baby, and I've just sinned. I can't take one of these goats in. God says, well, that's okay. You can bring a dove. Well, where do you get a dove? Well, I'm going to have to work for it. I'm going to have to get some fowling equipment and catch this bird in a snare and take it before the Lord and say, God, here, this is what I have. Thank you for giving me this, and I'm sorry for my sins. And there was still that expectation. Now, that's not, again, across the board, because earlier it says the temple tax or the tabernacle tax was a half shekel. And it even says, whether you're poor or rich, it's the same for everybody. So there were some things that were just ubiquitous and some things that were, weighted a little bit because there's compassion there. Again, there was still an expectation of the poor to do something and not just sit around. And then the final thing that I can think of as far as a positive is that every 50 years, all the debt would be removed and all the lands would be returned back to where they were first. So here's Terry, and she's on a farm and she falls behind. And so she sells it to Dan and Cheryl and says, here, would you buy my land for me? And then after 20 years, it's the 50th year, and they now have to give it back to Terry. And so she's kind of, in a way, she wasn't able to get the increase of the land, but you were helping her out. And so everything would kind of reset every 50 years in the year of Jubilee, where people could go back to that. And that, again, for poor people, was a way to kind of restart. Now, I'm glad we don't have that in America. I don't know what that would even look like. We have so many immigrants that it would be a pretty impossible thing. Go back to where you were 50 years ago. Well, 50 years ago, my mom was in Indiana, but, she was just maybe 4 years away from England and Australia. So that would have been a pretty tough thing, just a couple of years ago. So I'm not saying that we should adopt all these things. I'm just saying that there were some common sense and moral things to do to help the poor in ancient Israel. Both negative, don't do this to the poor, and positive, provide for the poor this way. There was no social programs like we have today. There were opportunities, creating opportunities for sustenance and work. Now, it's interesting that the more you dig into what different things are doing to eliminate poverty. The UN, their goal is to eradicate poverty, and they do it through various means. And some of it, the UN, my view is that the bigger the institution, the more likely it is to fail. Now, they have better resources and better education, and sometimes it's a wonderful thing to at least have some of those resources. But the view of the Bible, and my view is, which my view isn't on the par with the Bible, but the view of the Bible is that the people that are going to help you are the people that are nearby, not the people that are far away. Programs, so asking the question as we wrap this up, how has the war on poverty gone? What has it done? Well, we have spent from 1964 to 2012 $799 billion, which is $23 trillion in real-world money on poverty. And poverty is worse than ever. What our government has done in some ways is really taken away the ability of organizations and charities to actually do work, because what people can get from social programs or are now used to getting on social programs have far, as far as from a financial standpoint, far outstretched what we can do. Again, we talked about this last week, but the Bible says, and we'll look at this next week as well, if there are widows in the church, that the church ought to take care of those widows. Well, if a widow is used to getting $1,000 a month on Social Security, or whatever it is, I don't even know. I'm just throwing a number out there. If a widow is used to getting that, that's something that would be harder for a church to try to provide every single month. But there are things that we can do. We talked last week a little bit about the standard of living. And so we're, as a church, it's not, whenever people, especially atheists and people that hate church say, you guys have all that money and what are you doing to help the poor? The question is, well, what can we do to help the poor? What should we be doing? What can we do? We cannot compete with $23 trillion. Now again, that's over years, but there are some things that we as a church can do for those in poverty. Is it right to expect that we would have some expectations? Is it right that we should have some parameters by which we would give or wouldn't give to people? Is it right for us to be able to say, I'm sorry, no, we cannot help you given certain things that we're thinking about? I'm going to show you next week in fact, I think I'll have them available on Wednesday night so you have time to look at them. But I'm going to show you the application that we use for people that are coming in and asking for help. And I'm going to maybe ask for some feedback on what we can do to make that better. But really just to think about that in terms of, again, so many of the programs that the government has are really just to try to get people in the system. And I remember talking to someone in the community who was a part of a government entity that was giving out money, and he said, unfortunately, because he had the mindset that I had, but he said, unfortunately, the goal of our workers is not to get people off the system, but to tell them the benefits they can get. And that has real serious consequences, and it really hamstrings what we as a church can do. It really is centralizing power and authority in one space, and as we're seeing, that authority does not always have the best intentions for society and for people. And so these are things to think about. And again, when we have in the Old Testament this example, it's worth praying about and thinking about and trying